Welcome to the ECPR series on Middle Eastern policy and EU relations. My name is Christos Kourtelis, and I am an assistant professor in European public policy at Panteion University in Athens. This series aims to promote an informed and nuanced understanding of the cultural, economic, and political dynamics shaping Middle Eastern societies, as well as their interactions with one another and with the wider world. It also provides a platform for balanced and substantive discussion. Today's session focuses on the role of civil society in the MENA region and the challenges it currently faces. We will explore the functions, obstacles, and strategies of civil society actors and consider how academic activism has been influenced in the aftermath of the war in Gaza. To help unpack these important issues, we are joined by two distinguished speakers from both the academia and civil society. Each speaker will have about 15 to 20 minutes to discuss different aspects of the topic. After the first round of presentations, the speaker can make a comment if they feel it is necessary. Otherwise, they can answer questions by the audience. And a quick note to the audience, please write your questions in the chat box, and we can take it from there. All right. The first speaker is Laura Horn. Is an associate professor in international relations and European integration at Roskilde University in Denmark. Laura's work focuses on European political economy, the dynamics of the EU integration, and the role of institutions and power relations in shaping European governance. She has published widely on these themes, and she is actively engaged in debates on democracy and capitalism in European politics. Laura will help us to understand better the current situation that academics in Europe and especially in Denmark face when they are engaged in political activism, especially after the war in Gaza, and if there are any changes in academic freedom and what these changes are. Laura will follow the introduction that is made by Larbi Sadiki, who is the editor of Routledge series in Middle Eastern politics. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. He's a scholar with the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science, and he's an expert also in democratization studies and political transitions. Previously, he was professor at Qatar University. He was also a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Middle Eastern Center and a senior lecturer and director of the Middle Eastern politics of the Middle East politics program at the University of Exeter. Larbi will help us to see the evolution of the civil society after the Arab revolts in 2011 and the type of help that these actors get from international donors like the European Union and the constraints they face. Unfortunately, the third speaker, Meryem Belhaj, couldn't make it. She sent us an email that she has some urgent work to do. And as I said, you can put your questions in the chat box, but if you feel that after the openings and the presentations of the speaker, you would like to ask the questions directly to the presenters, then you can unmute and we can have a more lively discussion. But before the presentation of Larbi and then Laura, I will pass the floor to my colleague, good friend, Dr. Assem Dandashly from Maastricht University. Assem, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Larbi and Laura, for joining us today. I think we meet at a moment when civic space across the MENA region is under unprecedented strain, unfortunately. Over the last decade, and especially in the past few years, civil society organizations, grassroots movements, student groups, independent activists have faced tightening restrictions, heightened surveillance, and increasingly punitive political environments. Legal frameworks have narrowed, political repression has intensified, and many organizations struggle with limited capacity and shrinking resources. Yet despite these constraints, civil society across the region has not disappeared. It has adapted to a certain extent, tried to reconfigure, some gone underground, gone digital, or forged new transnational alliances. In many cases, resilience has taken creative, unexpected forms due to the increase in restrictive measures that the governments in the MENA are practicing. At the same time, events unfolding in Europe are deeply intertwined with these dynamics. The European Union has long framed itself as a promoter of human rights, democracy, rule of law in the neighborhood. However, this self-image has come under increasing scrutiny. The genocide in Gaza, for example, has profoundly influenced public debate, both inside and outside Europe. It has raised questions about the consistency of EU foreign policy, the limits of a humanitarian commitment, and political pressures that shape institutional responses. Universities and academic communities have become part of this landscape. In many European contexts, the past year or 2 years has placed academic freedom under intense scrutiny, particularly in light of the Israeli genocide and the widespread documentation of the war crimes in Gaza. University campuses have become contested spaces where expressions of solidarity, whether through statements, research, campus gatherings, or student activism, have sometimes been met with institutional pushback, disciplinary procedures, restrictions on speech, or demands for political neutrality. Political neutrality only in the case of the genocide in Gaza, but not the same applies when it comes to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. These patterns have exposed deep inconsistencies in how academic freedom is protected and whose suffering can be publicly acknowledged. They remind us that academic institutions are not insulated from geopolitics. They are shaped by them, and they actively shape the boundaries of permissible debate. The Gaza context has made visible that academic freedom is not just a legal or normative principle, but a terrain of political struggle. Today's webinar invites us to think across the different levels, regional, European, institutional, and grassroots, and to ask how they inform each other. Our aim is to examine how civil society actors in the MENA region navigate restrictive political conditions, and how transnational solidarity movements and European actors can support, complicate, or sometimes inadvertently constrain their works. We want to explore both the possibilities for meaningful support and the structural limits that activists and organizations confront. Now, central to our discussions are several key themes, and then I will pass the floor to Larbi. First, the evolving landscape of civic space in the MENA region. More than a decade after the Arab uprising, and the trajectories of civil society have diverged sharply across the region. Some contexts have seen openings turn into reversals. Others have experienced protracted conflicts, economic crises, or renewed authoritarian consolidation. These realities shape what civil society can do, how it operates, and what strategies it adopts to survive. Second, the tensions between transnational support and local agency. External funding, donor agendas, and geopolitical interests continue to play a major role in shaping what civil society organizations prioritize and what they feel able to express. Questions arise about dependency, autonomy, and the political costs of relying on international partnerships. Using aid as a punishment by certain EU countries for those who have been outspoken regarding the genocide in Gaza is a good example in that sense. At the same time, global networks and solidarity movements can offer visibility, resources, and protection. Our discussions aim to unpack these complex dynamics. Third, the rise of transnational activism, including direct action initiatives such as the Flotilla movement, seeking to break siege or highlight a humanitarian crisis when governments have failed to do so. These forms of activism challenge state policies, mobilize public opinion, and attempt to shift the moral and political narrative around conflict zones. They also expose activists to considerable risks. Understanding how these networks operate and what impact they have on local mobilization and European debate is essential to thinking about the future of transnational solidarity. Fourth, the role of the EU, the so-called beacon of democracy, human rights, civil liberties. A central question for today is whether EU policy supports or constrains the space for civil society activism in the region. EU initiatives often speak the language of partnership and society activism and empowerment, but in practice, they reinforce security priorities, stabilization agendas, and risk-averse bureaucratic approaches. At the same time, the EU remains one of the largest funders of civil society in the region, and its diplomatic positions carry weight. This tension between ambition and constraints, rhetoric and practice, lies at the heart of many debates about Europe's role in the MENA region. Finally, we want to reflect on the ethical responsibilities of those who engage from outside the region, whether academics, activists, institutions, or ordinary citizens moved by humanitarian concerns. What does responsible engagement look like today? How can actors in Europe support rather than overshadow local efforts? And how do we ensure that solidarity does not reproduce hierarchies or instrumentalize those directly affected? These are not really abstract questions. They shape the everyday realities of organizations and individuals confronting difficult, sometimes dangerous political environments. They also shape the choices Europeans make about research, teaching, partnerships, activism, and public advocacy. Our hope today is to bring these different strands into conversation. We want to think about civil society not only as an object of analysis, but as a living, evolving set of practices that demand responsiveness, critical reflection, and ethical attentiveness. At a time of deep crisis, it's crucial to understand both what limits collective action and what enables new forms of mobilization and cooperation. Without further delay, we will start with the opening reflections and discussions by Larbi, followed by Laura, and then we open it for discussions. So the floor is yours, Larbi.
Salam, Assem, and Yasir Christos. Good to see you and good to be with you. And I think you have given us both food for thought, how we think about partnership, and I guess really about how to what are the toolkit, or what is the toolkit, the inventory in the toolkit of the academic to think about these issues. So I think from my part, I'd like to be a kind of devil's advocate by at least trying to dive deep into, first of all, the kind of epistemologies we've been utilizing to read the Middle East, to read the events that happen unfold in the Middle East. And I think that is really important. So one of them, by way of question, I don't have answers, these are like perennial questions that seem to recur, and also they force us, to revisit them. One of them is the utility, the explanatory power of existing theories in reading the situation, the MENA region, and the partnership between the EU and the MENA region. Without, I guess, really going back to issues that have been rehearsed by Kourtelis and others about the democratization paradigm, the utility of the democratization paradigm. Is it really something we can today seriously say we can talk about? And I'm saying that from the angle of someone who at the moment has got doubts about even the post, let's say, organization of power relations between state and society in the Middle East after the 2011 uprisings. Because really there are serious questions, not only about the state, and I think that's really where we make a big mistake, that we have this obsession with the state, and we think that the states are authoritarian. So where does this leave the societies of the region? Are they also authoritarian? Because after all, like, societies produce and recruit elites, and those elites are in charge of the state. They're at the helm of the states. I say that because when you look at or reflect on the Tunisian case, you have like really a promising revolution. You have the 2014 democratic constitution. Then you have 2 or 3 elections which were democratic by any standards. And then, you know, this democratic constitution and the attendant arrangements for supervision of power, for distribution of power, etc., have failed to defend the constitution, to defend the revolution, to reproduce the redistribution of power that came after 2014. These are really like serious questions. I think we cannot just really focus on the state. I'm not really trying here to give the state basically reprieve from criticism. No, the states are equally guilty of the situation that MENA region states and societies find themselves in today, whether it's Egypt, whether it's Morocco, whether it's Yemen, Libya, Tunisia, conflicts, autocratization, economic failure, and as Christos and Assem mentioned, also like, you know, going back to an old paradigm of dependence, which is really dangerous. So I think this is really conceptually and theoretically, we have not yet, in my view, as academics, because the onus also is on us to revisit some of these concepts and see really whether we can deploy them today to speak to explain what's happening in the Middle East. This is really important. I know sort of all of us speak about autocratization, about democratic backsliding, democratic erosion. Do they really make any sense within the Middle East? Because we haven't really had like proper, sustainable, reproducible democratic systems that we can actually say there has been forms of democratic backsliding in the MENA region. This is really important. Can we, for instance, apply autocratization in the same breath as democratic backsliding? So this is really, I think, the one thing. And this, I guess, really leads us to invoke the notion of authoritarian resilience. You know, I think democratic resilience is actually relevant to the MENA region. So conceptually, we have really, you know, to I think sift through the vast web of concepts and try, you know, to see which concepts are today relevant, you know, for understanding and reading and reflecting on these situations. So that's like the at one level. The other level, I guess, really regards the empirics of the situation in the MENA region. And I guess really we cannot talk about the MENA region in an even way. You know, what's happening in Egypt is different from what's happening in Tunisia. I still think in Tunisia there is probably a promise of rekindling the reforms that began in 2014. And it's something we can go back to in the Q&A session. What's happening in Yemen and Libya is a different, like, I guess, really set of problems, because you've got also tribalism, you've got regional division, you've got also massive intervention from outside. But I want really to, I guess, really go back to when I think of the region today, especially as Christos and Assem gave us actually a backdrop against which we can understand and read the events. One of them is basically the failure of the EU to defend its own values. Normatively speaking about democracy and human rights, you know, is almost like irrelevant today after the Gaza conflict. the EU did nothing at all and still continues to do nothing on that front. That's really one. Two, we go back really, I think, to reproduction of power relations, and as Assem say, hierarchies that really take you back almost to the 1990s, the way the EU tried to manage Mubarak and Ben Ali and so on. And I mean specifically by that, the ability of the EU to impose its own agenda, an agenda which is interested mostly in EU security. I think this securitization of politics and of the partnership, whatever partnership really mean, we've moved, from the, I guess, really association paradigm of 1995 to what's called today the pacts, for the Mediterranean, whatever that means. And we've got able people like Richard Young who've been actually critical of that EU pact, and they have basically been critical of it because really it does not normatively stand up or measure up to the values that we as academics and scholars expect, from those kind of policy documents and pieces of legislation. So in my estimation, we're really back to, I guess, really gatekeeping, that the EU is interested in gatekeepers more than anything else. So in the 80s and the 1990s, the big threat was terrorism. Now it's migration. So we needed almost watchmen against terrorism and terrorists. And today, really, we want basically watchmen who keep at bay the waves of boat people seeking, to go to Europe. And I think this is really where the normative agenda fails completely. This is really important, to, I guess, really utilize this as a departure point for exploring the brand of power relations that is being constructed today within the Middle East. Because really, when you look at events, and events, of course, like are unfolding and changing, and you go back and you see basically the EU having association with the powers that be in lots of countries which have got on their record grotesque human rights violations. They have autocratization, and the EU basically is guilty of not really supporting these regimes. I think this is really an old story that we cannot today, revive. It's obvious, to everyone, but also failing its own values. That's really important. I think the EU is not speaking its own language when it comes to its association with these states, and elites. And this is really important. The other one, I think, is from the angle of trying to de-orientalize, I guess, really the way we think about MENA in the context of democratization, whatever democratization means today, because I don't really think there's much left of what we may call today democratization, is the fact that we have to look at the situation holistically. By that, you cannot relegate the Middle East, to a sphere of exile by saying, look, the Middle Easterners cannot actually cope with democracy, or they cannot be democratic, and there is an Arab winter, an Arab Spring. Everyone, sort of have rehearsed this type of debates. Because if you look at international reports, whether it's the VDAM, the IDEA, etc., the world today has got more than 70% of its population living under less democratic regimes. You've got basically a decline in democracy And that decline in democracy is happening everywhere, including in established democracies. The entrenched democracies, the sources of the reigning wisdom of how to rule the world, the masters of the universe, so to speak, to use a term by John Pilger, are themselves actually failing democracy and democratization. That's really at one level. Looking, I guess, really closer to the Middle East, what you have today, you have really another type of association. You have states which, I guess, really are equally guilty of autocratization, and they are really trying, in a way, to, let's say, provide and furnish the means and the resources of how to keep it that way. Because really before, you can actually go to the EU and say, look, I need funding. But today you can actually go to other states. Some of them are oil-rich states, which actually can give you that funding without conditions. The conditionality thing has been solved for lots of these states. They don't really need the EU. See, the EU thinks it's actually sort of needed, but it's not really as needed as it used to be, because when you look at what's happening in IR, there's China, there's Russia, there's sort of the United Arab Emirates. There's, I guess, the sources of funding and the sources also of international legitimacy, strategic relations have also been modified. And I think that really works, to the dismay of those who have been expecting more democracy and less autocracy. I think this is, for me, a departure point for rethinking this whole business of whether the EU can actually be, as Assem mentioned, a beacon of hope and of light, democratic light, as John Keane say, like a democratic lighthouse. I think it's failing, in that regard, in that vocation. And I think this is really important also, to understand. And I think the critical question today, it's not only to question the powers that be, the states, but also the elites. Are the elites actually more democratic than the states? This is really important. What does it really sort of tell us? What does this story, the unfurling story of democracy and democratization tell us about the elites in the Middle East when they cannot defend their constitutions, they cannot defend their revolutions, they cannot defend their values and the normative templates they've started basically to construct up to 2011. This is really important. So we cannot really, on the one hand, it's like this disjunction between the binarism we play with, theoretically or conceptually, that states are autocratic, and maybe there is a more enlightened political society. I'm not really talking about actually society as in culture and knowledge and the repertoire, which is rich in the MENA region. Islamically is so rich in terms of literature, poetry, etc. I'm not really even talking about the repertoire. That repertoire is amazing. And I think the people are not even actually tapping into that repository of knowledge that can have, I think, huge impact on how to rethink actually democracy, including using local and indigenous resources of how to revive this hope of how to democratize. So I think this is really important. The disjunction between state and society is prevalent even in academic debates. When you look today how we talk about democracy and democratization, we tend, to zero in on the state. I think, in my view, that is really a bit of reductionism when it comes, to appending, these questions about democracy and democratization. I think I'll leave it there. I have other questions, but we can actually go back to them, in the Q&A.
Larbi, thank you very much for offering a very good framework of what goes on in the MENA and the challenges that the civil society actors face, and the problems of democratization, or the difficult efforts to democratize the region. Let's hear Laura presenting her thoughts and experience from the European context, and what happens when an academic becomes also an activist. Am I right, Laura?
Thank you so much, Christos. And thank you so much for this really comprehensive discussion of the MENA region. I should say I'm by no means a MENA expert. I also have a cat that I just need to shoo away a little bit because she will distract me. I'm really honored to be able to speak here in this conversation also with everybody in the room, hopefully. And I'm grateful. Let me get the cat away. Come on, off you go. I'm grateful that you're organizing this event, because we need to keep organizing. And we need to keep discussing options and strategic points, because I think, and I want to start my contribution with this, I think we're at a critical juncture when it comes to questions of civil society, of engagement, and the role of universities and scholars and scholarly communities, in particular when it comes to the genocide in Gaza. I think we've reached that point where very soon we will see that people are writing papers on Gaza as analytical pieces, as data points. We already see that, and I don't mean scholars from Gaza. I don't mean affected people sharing their perspectives. I think we reached that point. We've seen that also with, the revolutions and everything that happened after 11, that it becomes a historical fact that we can research, and that will change the way universities can position themselves, scholars can position themselves. We can have that comfortable difference and that comfortable distance between, oh yeah, that's a thing that happened. It has nothing to do with us. And I think we need to fight exactly that distance with everything we have, because the very heart and soul of our universities and our scholarly work revolves around it. So I think that question, the material question of solidarity, the ideational and ideological question of solidarity, is something that is intimately related to that, of course. So I want to sort of go into this space of discomfort and this critical juncture where we are right now, and think together with you what is to be done then. One starting point for that is to see both us as individual scholars, but also our learned communities, our universities as institutions, as part of civil society, not as something that is distinct. It's too easy to make that analytical distinction that, civil society is all the NGOs, but we are just as much part of civil society. And Assem, I think your opening talk made that very clear. So to mobilize that responsibility and to speak to that responsibility, I think, is something that we need to do in whichever context and whichever platform we can get. Because again, it is easy to forget. And that is part of this, this way in which our universities are now positioning themselves, the modern, thoroughly managerialized, neutral university that really just wants to service the powers that be. And that, of course, affords a position where you can say, but we're just neutral observers, right? And again, in the months and the years to come, with this discussion that, of course, there's a truce. Now the reconstruction starts, and now we can study that. We can offer our services for the reconstruction, but as neutral observers. I think that is very, very dangerous. I will, in a moment, put it in the chat as well. Nicola Pratt has recently written a very punchy piece on scholasticide. And I think for us, you know, with all the genocidal dimensions in Gaza, I think for us as scholars, in this scholarly community, and that is also what the ECPR is, of course, I think this concept of scholasticide is a very, very important central node through which we can also read our own role and our own responsibility and some of the strategies maybe that we have that other people don't have. So I want to go a little bit into that as well, but also point to some of the limits and the boundaries of that. So our responsibility in our work at the university. I will try and keep it short so we have time for discussion. So let me jump right into it. Again, I'm not a MENA scholar. I'm a political economist. I have to say I was an activist before, more on climate justice. But if you say climate justice, you know, we have to say ecocide. And if you say genocide, then ecocide is most commonly part of that. Because social reproduction goes both into the ecological and the human perspective. The two cannot be separated. But I have not been a Palestine activist before. I've not been sort of in the solidarity movement very strongly. I was one of those sort of comfortable, you know, let other people do the Palestine stuff, I do the green stuff. And I think, you know, the fact that people like me were mobilized, and that many solidarity movements at university managed to get people on board who weren't MENA scholars, right? Who weren't, you know, scholars of migration, scholars of, you know, decolonization, but, you know, not even social scientists, right? You get the natural scientists, you get people who have absolutely no scholarly relationship with anything that's related to what is happening, what happened in Gaza, you know, not just in the, you know, genocide of the last couple of years, but the last 50 years, the last, you know, 100 years since, you know. I think that is definitely something that mobilized people and that showed that there is still hope for universities as places of, again, discomfort, places of solidarity, places of critical mobilization. And then the backlash came. And I think we all heard stories. Some of you in the room might have experienced the defensive, regressive, reactive, violent ways in which many university leaders acted against solidarity, mobilizations, actions. And of course, these all come on a spectrum. Depending on where you are, if you're based in Germany, you know, then the repression was unbelievable, and hopefully will be studied in years to come by critical scholars and exposed for what it was. I'm based in Denmark, and I should say comfortably as a permanently employed person, which also makes differences, right? The vulnerability of scholars is something that we often don't think about when we think Palestine solidarity activism, but it was predominantly younger colleagues as well as some of the older colleagues, right? Both in terms of age as well as early career scholars who actually were sort of leading and driving and inspiring many of these forms of activism. And the bloody courage that comes with that is something we should all keep in mind. In particular, those professors that I know in the context where I am, you know, people in positions of privilege who just really kept their mouth shut because that was more convenient. And then you never know if you're going to get, you know, if you're applying for that big grant, you might not get it if your name pops up in newspapers. So there are all sorts of limits. I don't want to really go too much into my own experiences because I think the risk to center oneself is also one of the things that we're seeing right now. My experiences of repression, I'm very lucky to have a group of people I can discuss them with, and I have platforms I can write about. But the many people who have also experienced repression and are not in positions of privilege that I am, I think we should make sure that we keep records. And those records are already being written, right? There are all sorts of institutions where you can write to if you experience repression. But But I think they point towards the very real limits of what academics can do, the kind of challenges of how we can show solidarity, how we as civil society from the European perspective can support civil society in the MENA region and in Gaza more specifically. One of those challenges is that we see them now as charity cases. Right? There's a decided focus on all these poor people. Now they're all living in tents. Again, going back to this idea that there's a scholasticide going on that is relevant to us as scholars, as direct solidarity with those people who are what we are, scholars, right? Helps us to keep in mind that there's something here that is directly pertinent to us, academic freedom. The very fact, the material conditions that need to be in place to actually do research, that thing that we love, right? The systematic destruction of education at any level in Gaza, the lack of funding to rebuild, the lack of prioritizing of funding, the fact that our colleagues in Gaza are starving and freezing, not as charity cases, as those poor people in the tents, but as our colleagues, as people who could publish just as much as we do, if you're into that rat race. But if we kind of think in those ways and we remind ourselves that this is the case, I think that will be part of the work from now on, because it is too easy to just sort of go, oh yeah, but that conflict's been resolved. But it hasn't been, and it will not be for a very, very long time. So the really heavy solidarity work starts now, because it is also material. It's not enough to put on the kufye. It's not enough to have a little, watermelon pin on your label. We need to think material realities. We need to think, where can we do what? What kind of solidarity mechanisms do we have? At which level of our organization? Our learned communities? How can we lobby our national, international, regional bodies like the European Union to actually walk the walk and not just talk the talk? So it's material solidarity we're after. But here come the challenges, because what we see again is that in this, the last couple of years, where many academics have either experienced or seen repression, a lot of discussion has focused around academic freedom and around our institutions themselves. And I get a sense that to some extent that has turned, into an overshadowing, I think you called it, Assem, an overshadowing of the actual lived realities and challenges on rebuilding on the ground, right? So what happens if we now focus more on the institutional power struggles, on ourselves, on our own conditions, which are really dire and we need to fight for them, but we cannot center them over the struggle, I think. And this is a real challenge, because, we're all in that rat race and many, many, many people are burnt out. So I don't have answers. I just want to remind all of us that, it doesn't stop at the kind of, solidarity work that we do. We have a weekly stand here at the university where I am. But if we take ourselves as critical scholars seriously, then we need to keep fighting, and we need to keep supporting those civil society groups that actually do the work, like the Flotilla, right? But also so many of the other institutions, and think of, all the many different ways that we could do while we fight our own universities and while we struggle to maintain those spaces for academic freedom. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Laura, thank you very much for the very insightful, presentation and discussion about academic freedom and the challenges that we face in Europe. And we can open the floor for questions, but I was thinking of making the first one to Larbi about the civil society in Tunisia. And, Tunisia, Larbi, was considered as a success story after 2011. But after 2019, we see some challenges that civil society faces. So I wonder, how has the Tunisian civil society changed since the Arab revolts? and how these changes have affected the democratization trajectory of the country.
Yeah, thank you, Christos. Tunisia has, I think, let's say, the building blocks of a polity that can eventually, I think, rekindle the democratic project. And people really, that quest for, let's say, better government or good government, whatever really you want to call it, can be constructed, because really it's got actually remarkable people, and we've seen that time and time again in different events that unfolded in Tunisia. And one of them, of course, even in to go back to the solidarity with Gaza, it showed really that civil society maybe has submerged, it's kind of in a state of dormancy, but that doesn't really mean it's actually dead. And the solidarity that was shown to the Palestinian people, including, and this is really a new phenomenon that you find across the board in Egypt, in Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Jordan, the ultras, the football ultras, which have been really amazing. You would never think of football ultras as, let's say, a space where you can find values of solidarity and values really that speak to, I guess, really political presence and vocalizing the kind of, I guess, really criticisms that we've seen in the region because of what happened in Gaza, because they reminded us, and I think this is really one lesson, to take from what we call in Arabic Sharia Siyasiyya. It's a stratum, political stratum, which is there in the Arab world, that what happened in Gaza is actually an Arab failure. It's a common failure. That the Arabs as a people, as a collectivity that is endowed with history, with common values, history, the history of colonization, etc., could not actually defend, their brethren and sisters in Palestine. And I think what dawned on them was basically that notion of precarity, Arab precarity. Because really, when you talk about actually, and I really want people actually to think about it, this is really important. When you look at the land mass occupied by the Arab, the Arab peoples, from Morocco all the way to Yemen, you're talking about 13 million square kilometers. Only the Russians have got more land than the Arabs, 13 million square kilometers. And you've got 450 million people who are today so fragmented and so divided. This is really important. You cannot actually tap into this amazing demographic potential, civilizational repertoire, and frame it democratically unless you have actually good governance and good rulers. This is really important. I think the Arabs actually have ceased to think about actually what they have. They've forgotten this. And I think that's really what you find in those ultras, whether you're in the stadiums of Morocco or Tunisia, you find those kind of messages. So civil society, and I'm also really critical of civil society, that it did not do enough to defend itself. But we are really also at a stage where you have to invoke the notion of dictator's learning curve, the famous, 2012, Dobson book. I'm not too enamored, by the ideas in the book. It's a bit superficial. But really, we are actually at a historical juncture that makes you think that the type of authoritarianism that we live with today is different from the 1980s. The state is smarter today. The regimes are smarter. The regimes can go to technological savvy elites in the West and say, look, we want spyware. We want basically, to listen to what the political parties are saying, what the dissidents are up to. And I think that giving them or enable them to reproduce themselves. So the state, the authoritarian state, has become actually smarter than what it used to be. And that is really important. And there really you see like the double edge also, of technology. Technology can be basically a blessing, but also there is a curse inbuilt, within technology. So civil society sometimes, and this is really important, the way I try to frame reflection on politics in the Arab world is not too different sometimes, from the state, because we've reached a situation. I'll give an example, in Tunisia, where people, after the change that happened, in Tunisia, let's say, like the dismantling of the democratic constitution of 2014, that is really important, and the closure of parliament, in 2021, the summer of 2021. I was actually there in those events that unfolded, unfortunately, at the time, in Tunisia, that the kind of morality that you need to support democracy and drive, I guess, this cultural project, this moral project, this normative project seemed to be lacking. Those values seemed to be lacking because there was, for instance, at the time, so much hatred against an ideologically, diametrically opposed political party, which is the Islamist party, MENA. There was hatred against them. And really, if you basically go that way, the slippery slope of hatred in a polity, any polity, basically exclusion follows. And then you've got repression also, follows, because governments also can say, look, society, this is what society wants. Society wants these people excluded or that party excluded, etc., etc. And look, the authoritarian playbook is one. Doesn't matter whether you're in Egypt or in Morocco, or Libya or Tunisia. Once you basically start excluding the Islamists, who do you think is going to come next? The leftists, and then there's going to be the women, and then there's going to be the liberals, the so-called liberals, etc., etc. And this is really why we have basically to work sometimes, with modest, minimalist definitions of what we mean really by democracy. And I think for me, from my perspective, really very, a parsimonious definition is the representation of difference. That we have really, at least as a person who believes in democracy, whatever that is, that you believe in difference, that others have to coexist with you in any polity, in economy, in culture, in knowledge practices, in universities, in the public squares, because this is really the lesson of what happened, in Tunisia, that, for democracy, you need actually to pluralize the scene. Going back to political singularity is not going to provide you with the means and the resources to build, good governance and good government. This is really important. So civil society is fragmented too, has got its own moral blindness, in the sense that it's colored by, let's say, the pathologies of, politics. So you find really people who are actually anti-another, or they're basically against the left, or against, let's say, migrants, etc., etc. I think these diseases, these are real diseases, in the Middle East. And sometimes you talk with colleagues, I'm pretty sure, Christos, you have the same problem, in Greece. I don't really want actually, to say these problems exist only in the Arab world. They exist really everywhere today, because we are really at, a juncture of populism and far right, politics, etc., etc. And this transnationalization, of these kind of ideologies across the board, happens in Europe. Look at the far right, our travels, in Europe. The same we have, in the Arab world, that like this transnationalization of anti-Islamist, let's say, politics, or anti-left politics, or anti-democracy politics. I think this is really important. So civil society is no different from the elites that govern, these countries. They have got actually the same exclusionary instinct. It really is an instinct, because it's so impulsive, and it really is intent on thinking in a very populist way that by excluding, one party, then, you're going to have democracy. And we've seen actually the opposites. This happened in Egypt. Remember, like in Egypt, so you start with the Muslim Brotherhood, and then you said to the Salafis, it's okay, you can stay in parliament, but 2 years down the road, the Salafis basically go to prison, and then the left go to prison, etc., etc. And this is really why, when you talk about a polity, you really must actually think of the commons that can unify a polity normatively. What are basically the common values that you need, to construct, a polity, a self-regenerating, functional, reproducible democracy. That is really important. Like, if you really just like weaken and give way to this thing that, one party excluded is the solution, then you are really actually committing, sort of harikari, so to speak. That is really one way actually, of starting, sort of, this slippery slope of, autocratization. Yeah. So I think this is really the authoritarian playbook. We've seen this, across the board, in Egypt, in Tunisia, in other places. It's really important that we cannot say that polity is something and society is something. I think they are really the interplay between the two in terms, of transfer of norms, the social capital that I guess really we utilize to recruit elites, political elites, and political leaders. It's all like, from the same source. This is really important, in my view.
Thank you so much for the elaborated answer. I'll move to Laura, because I think she has to leave soon. One question, we see like the crackdown on academic freedoms moving across the Western world. Actually, it's worse than in dictatorships in the MENA, unfortunately. How do you see the future of academic freedom? Because when we look at the US, we look at Europe, we see a lot of crackdown, censorship, what you can say, what you cannot say, the fear of being labeled certain terms. If you criticize, if you say the word genocide in some European countries, you're criticized of being anti-Semitic or so. So how do you see the future of academic freedom, especially because you mentioned if you're tenured, if you have a permanent contract, you're less under pressure, while like the others could be fearful also to what they write or what they put on social media, or even academic writing. If you tackle the issue of Gaza, or what's the democratic backsliding in Germany or other countries in Europe. So maybe in a couple of minutes before you leave.
Sure, absolutely. I think we need to, under all circumstances, make sure that this is a collective struggle and not something that is individualized. Because systemically, structurally, we are being more and more atomized, individualized to the competitiveness that is on all levels of our academic work. And that plays together with this, dynamic of, for instance, self-censorship, because you do need to get a permanent job. This, academic work is work, and so there are certain logics at play. And if those logics say, you want to get a job or you want to keep your job, but you can only do that if you do not mention certain words, if you do not research certain things, then, it's very rational to say, yeah, sorry, I have a mortgage. I can't. So we will not win this at an individual level. We need to mobilize, again, whatever local communities we have, institutionally. We need our trade unions to become much better to support both those people who are already under attack, as well as stand up for academic freedom, and to insist that this is not just freedom of speech, but that also the mechanisms and the platforms that, as Larbi said, that allow for diversity, that allow for this exchange of ideas, even and in particular if it is uncomfortable. Right? It's that discomfort that we need. We don't need to be in agreement. I mean, even if you go into, Palestine solidarity groups, people are certainly not in agreement with each other, but people understand that there is a need for engagement and for dialogue. And again, this isn't about Palestine solidarity. At some level. I mean, it is materially, and the solidarity, again, as I said, we need to retain that. But there is this other dimension of the struggle, which is for the very idea of the university that many of us subscribe to, or that many of us hope to be part of, right? So at whichever level of, seniority or generation you are at, this really is a critical juncture, because if we now move on and pretend that, yeah, it was unfortunate, couple of people, got arrested or, were blacklisted, whatever, then it will happen again. And we will see that with regard to, what happened in Palestine or, other forms, we'll come into that territory that Omar al-Akkad has said, one day we'll all have been against it. And this is also now our responsibility, as we are right now. If they forget, we will remember. I think remembering is a really, really important function right now, and saying over and over again, you didn't do anything. You didn't do anything. You do not get to take moral high grounds. You do not get to waffle on as a supervised chancellor or this or that or the other about academic freedom and equality if you don't actually engage in what could have been done. So there are many different levels of support. Finding your people, rejecting this individualization is the very first starting point. So finding people, talking to people, saying, I'm experiencing this, takes some courage. Finding a named person or a shop steward or someone in the local solidarity group and saying, out loud what is. Rosa Luxemburg once said, it's the most radical act that you can do. Say out loud what is. And then take it from there institutionally. Insist on opening up spaces for, freedom of academic engagement, not just speech and research, but also engagement at an institution, I think, is a responsibility that we all have right now.
Thank you very much, Laura,
Thank you so much.
for your answer. We wonder if any from the audience has any questions to the speakers. Please, you can unmute or put your questions on the chat.
I know, Laura, you have to leave, so feel free to leave any moment.
Thank you so much. Apologies, I have kids, but thank you so much for this event, and let's keep talking.
Yeah, absolutely.
Take care,
Thank you very
much. So much.
Thank you very much.
Solidarity. Bye.
I have a question for, okay, Farzad have a question. So please go ahead. You can unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I hope you can hear me well. And I wanted to take a second to thank you for organizing this event. I really enjoyed and learned a lot. I wanted to, first of all, I'm a PhD student in Department of Sociology of Trento University, doing research about political activism, migration, and exile. A lot of things that you brought to this webinar were actually things that I'm dealing daily, apart from the research that I do, also from my own personal background as having 15 years of political activism and experience of detention and migration and exile and displacement. I'm also Middle Eastern. I'm from Iran, which is not being defined as an Arab country, but is being widely accepted as a part of MENA region. Apart from that, my question for me was very interesting that what you mentioned about commons that can unify polity, the values, like talking about more than 400 million people in a big territorial, geographical scale, being fragmented. And can ethnicity or language, in this case Arabic, can be one of those commons that can unify polity? And in that case, are we talking about the pan-Arabism of Nasserism during those years, or it's something new? Because this is personally for me, it's very interesting. I'm trying to understand the mechanisms. And what are the roles of historical institutions here? What are the roles of centuries of different methods of production of knowledge, which in many cases, or at least in some cases, are not possible to put them in the same basket of modern academic institutions, the modern ways of production of knowledge, or even so like the colonial way of framing it. And the last part of my question is the role of academy here. By academy, I mean literally academy of today, like modern Western things that we know where it is, because we are in it, and we all, I guess we all know the limitations it has by framing Middle Eastern issues and creating a space for historical, long-standing institutions that are being forgotten also by the very local Middle Eastern institutions. So I know my question is very wide, but I would really, really be thankful if you can share anything with me. And I really, really thank you for organizing this learningful event. And I'm very keen to hear your answers. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you, Farzad. Any other questions? Maybe we can collect two more questions for Larbi. I don't know if anyone else has a question.
I have a question. Can
yes.
I? So thanks, Larbi, for your intervention, also for your insights. With the decline in the rule of law and the crisis of rule of law in the EU, to what extent can the EU still sell the idea of democracy promotion, norms, values in the MENA? And to what extent the public opinion in the Arab world is still favorable of anything that comes from the EU? Maybe like from the Tunisian perspective, because I think the EU failed Tunisia big time, but also in the MENA region more generally.
And Sarah?
Hi, I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much for this very interesting seminar. I have a question regarding the pact to Professor Sadiki. If you have like some, I don't know, opinion that you would like to share, you mentioned it during your intervention. And then another question, I'm not sure if there is the time for this. You talked about how the EU can be actually a disabler for civil society and grassroots organizations due to this securitization, let's say, aspect that is being pushed so hard. And I also have a question indeed on how can we untangle this constraint that financing represents for the civil society in the MENA region, because on one hand, they are dependent on this funding and they're asked to speak the language, right, of the EU in order to access these funds. And is there a way to actually break this kind of neo-colonial dynamic, in my opinion. And yeah, if you have any thoughts on that, it's more broadly also to the conveners of the seminar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Larbi, the floor is yours. Very interesting questions.
Thank you very much. These are really challenging questions.
Indeed, especially the one about historical roots. I find it.
Yeah, we can really think together, I guess. We put our heads together and interact on them. That's really, I guess, really the perennial question about institutions. As you know, like the post-colonial state, in a way, I think was built, in my view, on weak foundations, and those weak foundations basically tried, to divorce the region from, as we all agree, from this repertoire, this amazing repertoire. And when I say really repertoire, because of course, like, remember, Black Athena, when you talk about actually how the world of ideas and ideologies and knowledge practices was constructed, and civilizational units, and who are civilized and who are not civilized, etc., without really rehearsing, some of the Bannerisms and I guess really the hubris that was attached, to all of this, is that the departure point was wrong, because indigeneity and the indigenous repertoire, cultural Islam, we have to say the word, that is really important. All of that basically was really put on the back burner, that if you are going, to seek modernization or development, whatever it is, then you cannot really look back, to the past, and you have to be future oriented and orientated and forward-looking, etc., etc. And I think this culturalism, this culturalism was very, very dangerous, because people cannot advance, with the normative cultural tools of others. And I think this, the MENA, the way I understand it today, MENA region has been basically operating on the basis of outside ideas and outside ideologies, etc., etc. This is really important. Okay, so really in terms of knowledge production, and I think that is really the most dangerous, the production of ideas, the factories of ideas, the manufacturing of any kind of consent, political consent, IR consent, geostrategic consent, geopolitical, consent, on how, to reframe the region, refashion politics. I think that is really important, and that is one area, that is deserving of reflection nowadays. I say that, and I give it just like an example. There's so many examples, but let me just single out one example, which I think really today is very much part, of this pathology of fragmenting the Arab world, the Abrahamic Accords, and how few countries, because of these treaties, and I really here, I would say, it's not because the Arabs, don't like peace. Yeah, everyone loves peace. At least, rhetorically, you love peace, and we committed, to it's an ideal, it's a value, but sort of peace making has also be founded on justice, and that is really important. And justice here is like for the Palestinian people, and I think we have the legal paraphernalia internationally which says a two-state solution. Now, if you look now what's unfolding, in the latest agreements, including the ones endorsed by the UN, does not even mention of a Palestinian state. And I guess really at the end of the day, you have to fall back on your civilization, cultural heritage, and your repertoire of, this millennial knowledge. What is it there for if it does not actually uphold at least this, notion of ba'adala, really Adana is like, the telos, for the Arabo-Islamic, I guess, really template of norms. That is really important. We don't even talk Adana anymore. This is really important. So for that, when you go back, to the institutions, about how to reproduce that heritage and how, to give it the glue that keeps it cohesive and coherent and able to reproduce itself. And I guess really live up, to the challenges of time and space. You need, and I think this is really how the Islamic was able to reproduce itself, over hundreds of years, is actually the decentralization of power. That is really important. So you had like Tashkent, you had Bukhari, Qarawaan, you had Baghdad, you had Dimashq, you had Al-Qahira, so really all of these centers of knowledge are so important. And you had, of course, like, and Iran is there, so we had Qum, and you had, all of these centers of knowledge making and production, of knowledge, which are really so important. And even if they were different in terms of exegesis, like the type of, or the brand of jurisprudence, they practiced, they did not actually engage in a kind of a hubris or exclusionary politics. This is really important, that you find someone like Ibn Khaldun born in Tunis, and then he goes, to live in Morocco, and then he ends up, to be Qadi al-Qada in Egypt, where he died. So you have basically, this open geography, open borders. When you look at the EU today, the EU today is telling actually the Arabs to have a barrier between Libya and Tunisia, to have barriers between Arab states, and really some barriers which are actually funded by the Germans and the Americans, a barrier being built as we speak between Libya and Tunisia, who've had for millennia porous borders. There's lots of intermarriage between Libyans and Tunisians and Algerians, and Tunisians, etc., etc. Even that you cannot actually construct today because of this securitization, as our learned friend, asked them. That is really a very good question. So the institutions that, let's say, engineered that kind of morality and knowledge and difference and pluralism, even if you look even at the Ottoman millet system itself, is like plural, of course, like it's built on fiscal conditions and, who's citizen and who is not, within like a concentric, formation, configuration of power, but still it has maintained a kind, of pluralism to be able, to reproduce itself, whether you're Muslim or Christian, depending really where you stand, in that concentric, configuration of power. And this is really, I think, really we come, to the nitty-gritty of, I think, in my estimation, of the biggest problem in the way we're trying, to construct politics, itself, with theoretical and conceptual tools, which are actually Euro-American. They have nothing to do, with the region. Because really Islam is not territorial. You really sort of, today being basically, in a way, guarded by the straight jacket of territorial identity, territorial morality, territorial interest. Why would, for instance, like the UAE pursue political agenda, geostrategic, agendas that makes it actually interfere in Yemen, actually occupy territory in Yemen, interfere in Libya, and interfere in Gaza in a way that is inimical to the interests, of the Palestinians. This is really important. It's like really, it's a different Arab world, and you cannot actually talk about that. You talk about like, academic freedom, and if the Tunisians say anything about this, then, all of the Tunisian laborers have to leave, the United Arab Emirates, for example. And I'm not really saying all things in the United Arab Emirates are bad. the great people, they help and they give aid, and they host like millions, of works, from the Arab world in Asia and so on. They do good things too. They build great cities, etc., etc. I'm not really trying, to just like say everything from that part of the world is bad. But like in terms of how you construct, this project, whatever that is, Arab, Islamic, etc., it's very, very dangerous. Because I mean, Farzad comes, from Iran. Iran today is like looked upon actually as the enemy. It's just like, sort of when people start celebrating the bombing, of a country from the MENA region, it doesn't matter what it is. I wouldn't be happy if, say, sort of the Cypriots or the Greeks or the Turks or anyone else, or the French, are bombed. That's not a good thing. It's not a good trait, to be celebrating the downfall of anyone. This is really important. So really, I return to this problem. The problem is that Islam is non-territorial, and the Euro-American project, foundationalist, project of building politics is very, very territorial. This is really, important. We're not even allowed, to do something like the EU. The EU, they speak different languages, and they have, different, actually, sort of, Greece was like, Black Athena, going back to Black Athena, was actually appropriated only like in the past, like 100 years or 150 years. But before that, it was like, relegated to a different, like, sort of like, cosmos, it was not like really part of, the European idea, so whatever that means. I mean, you see like, Melania today is trying, to theorize, a European identity and history and etc. Whatever that is, sort of you can do that, that's fine. So I think the institutions that you find in the Islamic, to go back like historically, they were actually plural. You find actually in a small country like Morocco, like 10 different schools of jurisprudence. And they all like, sort of none actually of them basically clashing with the other. That's the missing link in the chain of how to build basically nation, state, culture, knowledge. That's really important when it comes, to institutions. And that's really why, sort of, when we talk about the Pact for the Mediterranean, what is the Mediterranean? Sort of like really, sort of, it's a Mediterranean also that is ruled, by a Schengen piece of legislation that tells you you're an alien, you cannot go to Lampedusa. You have to actually sneak, through a boat, and you might actually drown, sort of what kind of pact? And it's really a pact that is about energy, security, etc., etc. And in a way, it's almost like, to keep at bay the others of the other, the European others of the other. That's really what it is, for the pact, really, in terms of let's say, like, the values and morality of equality. These are really terms that do not treat, let's say, like the neighborhood, the Southern Mediterranean neighborhood, as equals, because really this is like, fundamental, integral, central to the democratic actually imagination. When you imagine, the imagining of democracy cannot be built, so without equality. But like, sort of, Europe is actually more equal than, the rest, whatever the rest is, sort of, nowadays. So yeah, I guess really, then you talk about like civil society, and, our friend said, it's like a quasi-colonial. Yes, I guess really, if you don't have your own tools of that actually guide your own behavior, and I guess we carve out a margin of presence and existence for your own interests and your own morality, and others respect that morality, like Adala, for instance, is really important. This is really important. A civil society today that is sometimes really coached into, let's say, excluding, say, the Islamists. That's good. I mean, it's a very unwritten rule, of politics today, that the Islamists maybe should not like rule, any country, in MENA. And you've seen after what happened in Egypt, 10 days later, Cameron was in Egypt. Siemens was in Egypt. The companies went, to Egypt, etc., etc. Because we say democratically elected, that is the value. But sort of democratically elected doesn't work in the Middle East. Because, when Hamas won in 2006, we said, no, that's not actually democracy. Okay, what about the Egyptians? They had, democratic elections. That is not democracy. But today, sort of to have electoral autocracy or enclosed autocracy is okay. So it's that kind, of refreshing, of polity and society and culture. And I think that's really very dangerous. So really, how does the EU sell itself? I think today in, Assem, Christos, in the current historical juncture and in the background, we have today, which is the Gaza genocide. It's got no other name. That's what it is. It's very difficult to be really selling, that project. You cannot sell that. And I guess really, Assem, you were really intent on using the word, sort of sell, package, sort of it's almost like an economic, package, with some aid, sort of, et cetera, et cetera. Sort of. No, you can't. It's just the EU itself has really, sort of is in need of its own intro inspection. And that intro inspection can come only from Europeans, because the Middle Easterns or the North Africans cannot tell the EU how, to run its affairs. But the EU still is expecting, the Algerians and the Moroccans, and the Tunisians and the Egyptians, of how to run, their affairs, their oil, their gas, so their alliances, their universities, their knowledge production, etc., etc. And also notice that it's really a dangerous, historical juncture, because the old centers of knowledge production, and this also speaks, about Fazad's, question, are almost basically muted. Cairo is not, a center of knowledge production as it used to be. Today, you need basically media cities, whatever that is. People talk about the Dubai media city. Okay, sort of fine. They talk about the television channels. People talk about Al Jazeera. They don't really talk about Jamiat al-Qahira. When Cairo University used to be something. An institution of learning, deep learning. Sort of millennial, traditions. Which you find in Morocco, you find in Egypt, etc., etc. So
we can get one last question from Spiros. Spiro, you can make a quick question. Hopefully, you can have a quick answer, because we're way over the hour and 30 minutes.
Yes, I saw the time. So thank you very much for your intervention and your presentation. And I would like to give congrats to the organizers, Mr. Christos Kourtelis and Mr. Assem Dandashly. My question is, how could the EU, I mean the current EU Commission, von der Leyen, play a crucial role in cooperation with international organizations such as the UN or the Organization of the Islamic Conference, if I'm not mistaken, if I say correct? How could the EU and other international organizations reinforce democratic spirit and values in this part of our world, in the Arab world? And how could the Union encourage the role of civil society organizations in this area in order to promote these values such as peace, freedom, because, as you have said before, democracy cannot be easily implemented in this region. Is there another possible solution for this for this problem? Yes, that's my question.
Thank you, Spiro.
Thank you, Spiros. Yeah, it's really it's a very intelligent question. I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer that, but obviously, one of them is like, to have a dialogic, spirit, because really the EU usually seems, to be occupying the high moral ground that actually it's got what it takes, to spread, its own ideology and morality and so on. And no denial, Europeans have got, that's the coveted, possession, of democracy. And the Muslims really should not basically be threatened by that. Democracy is a good thing, at least like as an ideal, as a value, sort of all of us want, more democracy, less autocracy, etc., etc. But really to do that, fundamentally, you have to be dialogic. And you have actually, to engage in some kind, of cross-cultural, pollination, that is really important. Because I think that's like, the missing link, that you're not actually listening to what others actually, have to say. That's, you've seen basically, President Trump, maybe he's got like, good intentions and good interests, but like he's got also to listen to what others, have to say. That's really important. You cannot just like, superimpose, agendas. This is very, very important. And the other one also is like, if there are good practices, those good practices, should be basically shared. I think there are even good practices, in the Middle East. We in the Middle East, actually, in MENA, there are good practices that we don't actually share with each other. Sure, and I can mention like a few, like so for instance, like the in the informal arena and sphere, there's lots of, let's say, demotic traditions which are not actually replicated, institutionally. That is really important. I think the world today, in my view, especially like this so-called rules-based, international system, I think has collapsed, because of Gaza, etc., etc. And I think Spiros, rebuilding that is like starting. And to rebuild that is really important, because at the moment we see really where we are heading. We are heading to a world where Russia and China have become basically a bloc. The Arab world is so fragmented, I think at the moment we are really on the cusp of maybe a new set or a series of Abrahamic Accords. God knows, when's that really going to happen. But I think that's basically at least one of the intents, of the Trump administration at the moment. At whose expense, that's really going to be. What is the role of Palestinians, in all of this? Because remember, like, self-determination, that is like whatever universal means, but at least universal good. There are universal goods. What are the universal goods? And self-determination is one of them. Can we grant that to the Palestinians? That is really important, because really sort of the agreements, the most recent agreements, don't seem to really give way to the Palestinians in terms of their right, to self-determination, statehood, and so on. So really, legally as well, like there's lots of good things the UN did, because you say like the UN, the UN, for instance, had resolutions that probably can facilitate and mediate Palestinian statehood to coexist, with the Israelis. Fine. But all of that collapsed. I mean, Oslo was a good thing, but Oslo actually destroyed, that international legal foundation for preserving and safeguarding Palestinian rights. That's really important. And of course, like at the moment, the biggest problem, Spiros, and that, is actually migration. Basically, if you're like Moroccan or Egyptian or Sudanese, no one wants you to come to their shores. I'm pretty sure the EU can do, for instance, like, temporary work permits for people or seasonal work permits, something like that. But complete rejection, of these people. You can work with governments to find like, solutions. For 3 months, people can go and harvest, I don't know, in Greece or in Italy or something. That's better than just like saying, don't come altogether, drown in the sea. If you're like an Italian fisherman, you cannot save, these people. And these really are basics actually about like, sort of how to respect life and to respect otherness and so on. Really, we have to go back, to the basics. What are the basics, that can actually unify us so that we say, we can actually have partnership, whatever really that means.
Exactly, Larbi. Exactly. And unfortunately, the Pact for the Mediterranean downplays the role of democracy, and the efforts of democratization, I'm sure, will not, I'm afraid it will disappoint. Assem, you can make the final remarks. Thank you very much.
The biggest issue with the pact and all the EU approaches have been the lack of involving the local agency from the MENA region and treating the entire region from a very colonial perspective, and it still continues to do so. And the obsession by security and migration dominates its policies. Unfortunately, that we have to basically conclude because we ran already over time. But please stay tuned for our next webinar, which will probably be about Iran, which sometime by the end of January, right, Chris?
Yeah, something like that. End of January, beginning of February.
So we will basically post the ad hopefully by the end of the year or early 2026. Thanks a lot, Larbi, for your insights, for your thoughts, and also thorough comments, and staying with us almost
for so long. Yes.
for so long. And also, although Laura is not here, but thanks a lot for also her insights about activism, academic freedoms in the EU. And thanks for the audience and also for the questions that were raised. Enjoy your evening, and hopefully we'll see you in our next webinar. Thank you so much.